Well, hello and welcome to the Illinois Learn to Hunt question and answer series. My name is Dan Stevens.
And I'm Adam Wojciechowski.
And today we're joined by Peter Schlichting. Peter Schlichting is the Deer Project Manager for the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. So thanks for joining us today, Peter. And if you could give maybe just a quick introduction about what your position entails and some of your duties and maybe a little bit about your background before we get started.
Yeah, so my name is Peter Schlichting. I joined the department just this fall as the Deer Program Manager. And the main components of my job are managing the deer harvest data. That's a big part of it. I help out with some of our disease monitoring, especially CWD and our check stations. I also participate in our CWD management after the seasons close. And aside from that, we set countywide harvest quotas, and yeah, there's a lot of little things that go into those, but that's kind of the main bullet points.
Excellent.
And
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was born and raised in Illinois, and always been worked on large mammals, and so this seemed like a good fit for me to come back and work on deer.
Sure. And it sounds like you've kind of got your hands, foot, and a little bit of everything. You know, you've got some policy directives as well as some more kind of wildlife and population management type thing. So that's pretty cool. But we'll go ahead and jump right into our first user submitted question. This question comes from Lisa, and she asks, how does DNR measure the deer herd numbers?
Yeah, so we do this in a couple different ways, and it really depends on where we're talking about. So we kind of do it depending on how important it is to have like really, really good numbers. So in areas where we have CWD, we actually do aerial surveys where we have two biologists and a helicopter, and we fly around and we actually count the number of deer that are in different wooded areas. And it's not a perfect count, but we have a really good idea of our numbers within those forest blocks and those sections. Now our helicopter surveys are quite expensive, and so other ways of monitoring deer could be things such as pellet counts, where you actually go around and count the number of piles of deer pellets. You could also do browse surveys. You look at some of their preferred plants like trillium, and you see how often those are browsed. And these are great for parks or smaller areas that we're concerned about the deer population. Now, these are a lot less accurate than the aerial counts that we do in the helicopter, but they are a lot easier to perform, and they're a lot cheaper. And so we use these as sort of indices of how many deer we have in an area. If we have more pellet counts one year than the next year, we think we have more deer than the other year. But we don't have exact numbers. It's really a relative indice. But we don't really manage deer statewide. We don't really manage deer at either of those scales. So when we're setting up permits, for example, we're doing that at a county scale. So how do we get information at a county scale? Well, we actually use another index, and that's the number of deer hit by vehicles divided by the number of billion miles driven in that county. And so we know from past work that the more deer you have, the more likely you are to have deer vehicle accidents. And so because the Department of Transportation in Illinois records both of those numbers, we used that index as a way to say, is this population growing? Is it shrinking? Is it fairly stable? And then we can use that to set our management goals. And because it's another indice, we're not trying to get at exact numbers of deer, certainly not on those big scales. But it gives us an idea whether the population is growing or shrinking. And that's the information that we use for most of the state, aside from the CWD areas.
Excellent. I do kind of have a quick follow-up. You mentioned utilizing these, vehicle and deer collision numbers as basically a population index. Obviously, with the stay-at-home orders, we've seen a huge reduction in, just miles traveled for the past few months. Do you expect that to impact that data set, or is there a way you can kind of normalize it to kind of offset that the essentially the stay-at-home orders?
Yeah, so you would expect that we would see fewer deer vehicle accidents during this time, just because there are fewer people driving. So we expect to see fewer accidents, but we're also seeing fewer miles driven, right? And so we don't quite know how this will all shake out. When we get the numbers back, we'll have a better idea. But both the numerator and the denominator, the accidents and the miles, should go down. And so it could still be a very useful index. This is kind of an extraordinary situation, so we're not 100% sure how that's gonna perform. But in theory, both those numbers should go down, and we'll still be able to use that.
Excellent.
Okay, I think for question number 2, we have Lindsay wrote in, how has the addition of crossbows affected the statewide harvest?
Yeah, Lindsay, thanks for your question. We get this quite a bit. Crossbows are one of the more controversial things that we deal with. And since around 2013, our total harvest numbers have varied between 104 and 155,000 deer a year. And so we have not seen an increase in total harvest since crossbows became legal for everyone in 2017. What we have seen is we've seen a change in our archery harvest. So we're seeing that percentage of crossbows in the archery harvest continue to go up. So before they became legal for everyone, crossbows are about, I think, 14% of our archery harvest. This last year is the highest ever, and it was 45%. And that has steadily increased every year, basically. So have we seen the top of those crossbow numbers? I don't think so. Some of the states that have had crossbows legal for quite a few years are about 60% crossbow, or 60% of archery harvest is crossbow. So I expect that will probably continue to rise. Now, we had a record archery harvest this year, and is crossbows contributing to that? I think absolutely. What we're seeing, though, is people are switching over to crossbows, but we're also seeing at the same time a decrease in our firearm harvest. So that people are likely switching, either switching from a compound bow to crossbow, or switching from firearm to crossbow. And so we're not, in our total harvest, we're not seeing big changes, but we're it's sort of changing how and when people are hunting.
Excellent. We'll move right along. Our next question comes from Pat. He asks, why are landowners allowed to get free deer permits and public land hunters have to pay for theirs?
Yeah, so people hunting public land are using a resource that's maintained by public dollars. Now, the Division of Wildlife that I'm a part of does not operate on general revenue funds, so your general tax dollars. Permit sales and license sales, things like that, are what fund our department, and that's both public and private land. So those dollars that we take in from that are actually matched by the Federal Aid and Wildlife Restoration Funds, or Pittman-Robertson Funds. And so we get reimbursed 75% of what we spend using those dollars. So the permits that people pay for really go a long way in preserving our wildlife populations in the state of Illinois. The other main argument for this is that landowners, private landowners, constitute about 96% of the land in Illinois. And so giving out landowner permits encourages our landowners to be stewards for our wildlife populations and to manage their properties in a way that benefits wildlife. And it also recognizes sort of the conservation efforts that landowners already put into their properties. So that's sort of the main reasons that landowners are allowed to get deer permits.
Great. Next question is from Brad. Can you discuss the prevalence of CWD in the Illinois deer herd and what steps are being taken to curb its spread?
Yeah, Brad, absolutely. So since its discovery in 2002, prevalence rates of CWD in our Illinois deer are generally very low. And so in the counties where they're present, so the northern, basically third of Illinois, our prevalence rates are about between 1% and 2%. So of the deer that are harvested and tested in northern Illinois, we're between 1% and 2% generally. And Illinois, so as a general hunter, even in areas where we have it, you're not likely to harvest the deer with CWD. Illinois has a pretty aggressive management strategy for CWD, and some of the main goals are to monitor for the presence of CWD. We do that mainly through our CWD check stations. So during firearm seasons, hunters in certain counties are required to bring their deer in to get checked, and then they can voluntarily have their deer sampled. And this is really our best source of information for all of our monitoring programs. So it's hunter harvest that really drives us detecting when it has spread or moved or increased. In areas where we have CWD, we look to decrease the density of deer just in those areas. And so reducing density reduces the number of deer that can potentially get sick. It also reduces the likelihood that deer will leave that area and potentially bring the disease to a new area. And to that end, we introduced a special CWD season in counties where we have CWD. So again, we're trying to use hunters to be our main tool to combat the disease. So after hunting season is completed, we look at where we have detected CWD during that hunting season from our hunter samples. And then we use DNR sharpshooters to additionally reduce the density of deer, but only in the exact section that deer was reported as having CWD, and then we do the 2 sections that surround it. So we really the most information comes from our hunters during the seasons, and then we try to take a really surgical approach and just go to the areas where we know that we have CWD. And we do this to kind of get the most bang for our buck. We want to send our DNR employees, our DNR sharpshooters, to areas where they're most likely to detect or get sick deer. And of course, we always have permission from landowners when we're doing this. And in counties where we have CWD, we harvest around 15,000 to 17,000 deer a year. Our sharpshooters take about 1,000 more. And so again, these are out of very small pockets where we know we have CWD. So again, that's sort of the outline of how we manage. But for your average hunter, it's unlikely you will get positive deer, again, 1% to 2%. But it's possible, and as much information as we can get as a department really helps us. And the one way that you can make sure that you don't have a CWD positive deer is to get it tested. And we can certainly assist, and we pay for all those tests as well.
Perfect. Our next question is kind of a nice follow-up to that response. It really hints on and addresses the kind of the mechanism that the department utilizes to, like you said, reduce deer density in these hotspots. So Billy asks, why doesn't Illinois DNR use hunters instead of agency resources to cull the deer in these CWD areas?
Yeah, so that's a good question. We get this question a lot from hunters that are concerned about us coming in and shooting deer, potentially where they hunt especially. So first of all, hunters really are our first line of defense against CWD. The most information that we get on CWD, its prevalence, its presence, is from hunter samples. So we get an incredible amount of information from our hunters and from, again, our CWD seasons. Currently, we only allow Illinois DNR personnel and some USDA personnel around the Chicago area to do our sharpshooting. And that is for a couple of reasons. One is access and safety. When we approach landowners about sharpshooting on their property, we walk through with them where we're going to shoot, what direction we're going to shoot. We walk through all these security or safety issues before we ever get on the ground. And it's unlikely that landowners are going to let just anybody come onto their property and shoot deer at night over bait out of season. And so, especially in some of the more suburban areas, we might be shooting in a very, very tight window. There might only be 6 feet or so where you have a safe shot. And when we use our DNR personnel, we just have a level of safety that we can't ensure would happen if we let out recreational hunters. The second issue is hunter motivation. We need to get samples from specific areas, no matter what. Our DNR personnel are up for 10 weeks. We're in a blind 4 days a week for sometimes 8 hours a day shooting deer. And this is from late January to mid-March. So there's nights where it's -10, -15 degrees and you're in a tent. There's also days where you're walking through knee-deep mud to get to your tent. And so this isn't fair chase. This isn't hunting. We're out there as a management tool to reduce for disease management. There's not a lot of joy in the sharpshooting. And a lot of times we send sharpshooters to places where we really need to get deer out of, but there might not be a whole lot of deer. And so, for instance, we switched locations every night, but there was a 2-week stretch where I saw 1 deer in 2 weeks, and I sat in a below freezing blind for 8 days. And so it goes against a lot of the pillars of recreational hunting, and it's hard to get people to go out in those conditions and day after day after day. So those are the kind of the safety issues, and then the hunter motivation are kind of the 2 main reasons that we do not use recreational hunters for our sharpshooting.
Great. Okay, next question also ties into the topic of CWD. It is from Gustavo. Is Illinois DNR worried about potential human transmission of CWD similar to what's been seen from COVID-19 originating from animals?
Yeah, Gustavo, that's a really good question, and something that we as a department have to kind of constantly keep in the back of our minds. CWD is a lot different than COVID-19 or other virally passed diseases. CWD is caused by a misfolded protein called a prion, and it's part of a group of diseases called transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. I think I always get that wrong. And these misfolded proteins are found in sheep, cows, cats, mink, camels, and even in humans. And between deer, these misfolded proteins are transmitted by coming in direct contact with one another. So if they're eating at the same location, if they're licking each other, things like that is generally how it's passed between deer. So prions aren't airborne. They can really only get into humans if you consume a deer with CWD. So how concerned are we about this? Well, there's no documented case of CWD making the jump from deer to humans. So why are we concerned? Well, there's been some lab experience where they fed CWD infected meat to, I believe they were macaques. So they were fairly closely related primates. And it did make the jump from deer to these primates. And there have been other diseases, again, this type of disease is fairly common. And there's a disease called mad cow disease. It's the same form of these misfolded prions in cows. And between 1980 or so, when we think that the mad cow first started, and between it being banned in 1989, I believe nearly 800,000 infected cows likely made it into the food chain. And I believe it was like 143 people contracted mad cow disease. And that first started in 95, and the last case that was documented is in 2015. And so you think about 500,000 cows got into the food chain. That's millions and millions of pounds of infected meat. And, there are 281 cases. So you think about how much meat got into the food chain, and there wasn't, it took a long time, and there weren't that many cases. So when you think about how many pounds of infected venison likely has gotten into the food chain, it doesn't really near that number. So we can't say that CWD will make the jump to humans, but all signs kind of point towards that it's possible. And so a really easy way to be confident that you're not eating CWD infected meat is to get it tested. And we can do that either through our check stations or through several of we have vendors throughout Illinois that will take samples for you. And if it's positive, just don't eat it.
Excellent. We'll move right along. This is our last question about deer diseases, and then we'll get into a few different topics. Rachel asks, what is EHD? And she says, I remember after the year 2012, there was a significant EHD outbreak. Has the Illinois herd recovered from this? Yeah, so EHD stands for epizootic hemorrhagic disease, and this is a viral disease. So EHD is spread by biting midges. So it gets into the midge population, and they can spread it to our deer. So midges lay their eggs in like the muddy banks of streams and ponds. So when we have a drought year and the water bodies contract, there's a lot of this mud available for midge reproduction, and that tends to be when we have these outbreaks of EHD. So deer infected with EHD have excessive hemorrhaging internally. They lose their appetite, they lose their fear of people, they grow weak, and they also run a fever. And that fever, and they grow very thirsty, is why we tend to find them around water bodies when they pass away. And so they tend to submerge to lower their body temp. Other signs of EHD include blue tongue, due to lack of oxygen. They'll actually slough off parts of their hooves from EHD. But it's not always fatal, and so you'll see people deer that survive EHD are immune to that form of the disease, but it is like the flu where there are multiple strains. So EHD is actually pretty common. So every year we have EHD outbreaks. The year that Rachel mentioned, 2012, was one of our worst ones. So during that year, almost 3,000 deer were reported dying of EHD. And that's, I believe, the most of any year that we have records for. But there are likely a lot of deaths that went unreported. Those are just the ones that got reported to DNR. But as far as the population goes, deer have pretty much recovered. And one reason for that is sort of the transmission cycle of EHD is quite different than, say, CWD.
when we have a cold snap, when we have a freeze, those midges die, and that stops the disease transmission cycle. So if we have a bad year one year, it doesn't necessarily going to carry over into the next year. And it can have really big impacts on the population in a pretty small area. But good thing is it doesn't generally spread to very large areas. And that maybe not very consoling to if you're hunting areas in one of those areas that got hit really hard. But the good thing about deer is that they reproduce very quickly, and they can generally rebound from those losses within a year or two. So if you see any deer showing signs of EHD, report it on the DNR website, and there's also a link on the Wildlife Illinois website. This will allow our biologists to come out, take samples, and record where we're seeing outbreaks that help us monitor the situation.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Mark. What causes rut? Additionally, is rut generally around the same day every year?
Yeah, Mark, it's a good question. So the rut is caused by a whole suite of behavioral and physiological changes within male deer in the lead up and during the mating season. The further north when you're in a more northerly location, rut is actually triggered by changes in daylight. So as the days start getting shorter, as we pass midsummer, that triggers a gland in the brain called the pineal gland, and that starts a cascade of hormonal changes in deer, both male and female, that allow them to be able for breeding in the fall. So the reason that sunlight plays a big part of this is that breeding in the fall means that deer will be born in the spring right as vegetation is best, and it was most likely that the fawns will be able to survive. So the extreme end of this is if you get up into Canada, they tend to breed in a very short period of time, whereas if you go down to, say, Florida, they might breed for 9 months out of the year. So it really depends on where you're located. In Illinois, the rut tends to be the same time of year, and that is around mid-November. And so you can even see the deer in northern Illinois are a little more synchronous than in southern Illinois. And that is because it's all based on photo periods. So they tend to be, rut tends to be about a 2-week period in mid-November. But deer can get bred later than that. We know if we have fawns of that year get bred, it tends to be later in the breeding season into December.
Perfect. This next question kind of follows right along the same trend. Daniel asks, do older mature males dominate rut? And what percentage of young bucks are actually able to breed with does?
Yeah, so this is a really long-held idea that older bucks are able to dominate the rut and breed most of the does. There's been some advances in genetics and that have allowed us to look at this question a little deeper. And I'll make a big caveat to start with, saying that this really depends on what your population is like, where you're actually looking. So deer breed using what's called a tending strategy. So males, when they're during breeding season, tend or stay with one female while she's receptive, and then they move on to the next female. This is in comparison to elk that have a harem of multiple females all together at once. So males defend a female instead of a territory, and they might be with that doe for 24 all the way up to 72 hours. Where you have a balanced sex ratio, so equal number of females to males, and you have an age structure where you do have a fair few number of adult 2.5, 3.5 or older in the population, those older males do about 70% of the breeding. So it is a big chunk of the breeding when you have a balanced sex ratio and enough adult males. The majority of does are bred by adult males. But that still leaves 30% of does getting bred by younger males. And the number, this is from the genetic study where they actually have all the males and females in an area genotyped. Males breed up to nine does in a rut. So that was the max, was 9. Yearling bucks were even shown to breed. What they found is that yearling bucks tended to breed with yearling females. So the older a doe gets, the more likely she is to have twins, that they'll survive. And so the older bucks likely target those older females, leaving the younger does to get bred by the younger bucks. Now, another similar study showed that in populations where you have a really unbalanced sex ratio, so a lot of females, really heavy male harvest, the rut actually is prolonged because the females aren't bred the first time they come into estrus. And there you have a lot more younger males are doing the breeding. And so it is not beneficial to remove all but a few adult bucks. They won't necessarily breed any more does than if you have a more balanced ratio.
Great. For the next one, you touched on it for a brief second, but hopefully you could go in a little bit more in depth. Question is from Trisha. Are young does able to breed, and at what age do they become sexually mature enough to breed?
Yeah, Trisha. So again, we get this question quite a bit, and one of the great things about deer, from a management perspective, is they're very prodigious breeders. And in Illinois, about 20% of fawns, so deer born within that year, become pregnant in that fall. So born in May and they get bred in the fall. And so the percentage of does within each age class that get pregnant goes up until when you're 2.5 above, there's about a 90% chance you're going to be pregnant. But whether a fawn or really any deer for that matter get pregnant depends on their body condition. So if they have enough fat reserves to become pregnant, they usually do. So for fawns, the cutoff is about 80 pounds. If they can get to 80 pounds by that first fall, they will likely get pregnant. So fawns that are born earlier in the year tend to be more likely to get pregnant. But again, it's about 20%. By your second year, you're almost certainly going to be breeding.
Excellent. We'll move right along. This is our last question, and this question comes from Ted. Ted asks, suppose you have an older doe come in with a fawn, and you make the decision to harvest the adult doe. Does the fawn's survival chances significantly decrease? Yeah, this is a question I would imagine a lot of people have asked themselves sitting in a blind when they're making the decision of whether to take a doe or not. Fawns are weaned about 3 months. And so if they're born in May, they tend to be weaned in August sometime. And once they're weaned, fawns can survive on their own without their mother. So again, if you're in hunting season, even in early archery season, most of the fawns will be old enough to survive at that point. And even if their mother is killed, there's only been 1 or 2 studies on this, but it's shown that they have high survival even if their mothers are killed. Now, there are circumstances where you might have fawns that are born midsummer, and they could be still dependent on their mother once the seasons start. So a good rule of thumb is that if you have a fawn that still has spots, you should probably pass on the doe. But if the fawn
you know, looks like an adult, has grown out its adult coat, it's safe to take the mother. And so that if that fits your management plan to harvest some more does, then you can go ahead and take the adult.
Excellent. Well, that wraps up our question and answer session. So a huge thank you to you, Peter, for joining us and spending a few minutes with us and answering some of these questions. And to everybody at home, a huge thank you for watching, and hope we have a wonderful rest of the day. So thank you.